can actually do it. Welcome, everybody, to the Friends of the Cabildo second Thursday lecture series. This is a program that the museum runs with the funds from the Louisiana State Museum. So I'm Jason Strada. I'm the executive director of the Friends. So I hope this is my one chance. Chris is unable to do it to mention that this is like things that your memberships go towards, is providing funding for programs like this that the museum does, let alone our member lecture series as well, which comes with membership. So I hope you take advantage of that if you're not a member of the Friends. And tonight we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. We're going to be talking about Dr. Jennifer Gross of Jacksonville State University in Alabama. He's going to be talking about the Sisterhood of the Lost Cause. As someone who grew up in Mobile, Alabama, even in the 90s, I know this is not partially to exactly this topic, but the Lost Cause was a real thing when I was growing. I actually felt it as a child in Lower Alabama. So I'm excited to hear how this story is going to play out, and I want to welcome Dr. Jennifer Gross, and we're looking forward to hearing an amazing talk tonight about your great new book.
Thank you, Jason and Jen. Thank you to the Louisiana State Museum and to all of you for tuning in tonight to hear my talk about my book, Sisterhood of the Lost Cause, Confederate Widows in the New South, which has just been published by Louisiana State University Press. So you can go to their website if you like the talk and want to buy the book after this. So the Civil War is possibly one of the most studied and most written about events in American history. Despite this, there has been very little written about one of the most obvious ramifications of the Civil War, which is Confederate widows. And my book aims to rectify that historical omission. The book is broken up into two sections, and so I'm going to talk about those two sections in this discussion. The first section of the book explores how Confederate widows experienced their widowhood in the wartime and post-war South, how they experienced their emotions, as well as the practical experience of widowhood during that era. And then the second section assesses how white Southern society came to terms with Confederate widowhood. And it's in that section that I kind of shed new light on the history of the Lost Cause and its role in the New South. Now, while there's not really a way to give a completely accurate count of how many white Southern women were widowed by the war, just like we can never really have a completely accurate count of how many men died in the war, we can kind of come to an approximate number based on new research by historians. J. David Hacker, in particular, has done a lot of important work here in the last decade or so. He's estimated that somewhere between 752,000 and 850,000 American men died as a result of the war. He didn't delineate in his study exactly how many of those men were Southern, but he does estimate that somewhere around 300,000 Southern men died in that number. So, based on that, it's reasonable to assume that a pretty, that kind of staggering carnage left its mark on many a Southern home, obviously. Now, 300,000 men, obviously not all of those men were married, but we need to take into account how many of them were. So how do we get at that kind of figure? Southern marriage rates were likely high, right? Hacker has also done a lot of research on that for us. The Southern marriage rates among the age groups most likely to be soldiers in 1860 are telling. Among men ages 20 to 24, the marriage rate was 27.4%. That's not that high. That's 20 to 24. Among men aged 25 to 29, however, it was 79.4%. Among men aged 30 to 34 and 35 to 39, it was 79% and 85.4% respectively. Now, because men between the ages of 21 and 40 experienced a higher rate of death in the war, according to Hacker, it is reasonable to conclude that a large percentage of white Southern men who died in the war were married. In fact, it is reasonable to conclude that based on those percentages that I mentioned earlier, there were at least between 82,200 and 150,000 Confederate widows in the immediate aftermath of the war. Now, numerous scholars of Southern women's history have explored the I'm sorry, I think I did skip this page, sorry. So those figures are still likely on the low side. So by their sheer numbers, Confederate widows constitute a very obviously new group of Southern women after war, these women who are manless. Now, why is that important, that these women are manless? In the traditional gender roles of the antebellum South, women were expected to be dependents. They're first dependents of their husbands, of their fathers, and then when they get married, they're the dependents of their husbands. Now, obviously, there have been widows before the Civil War, right? As long as there has been marriage, there's been widowhood. Generally speaking, however, unless the widow was older or had inherited a significant amount of property, remarriage was the expected solution to the problem of widowhood. The problem for the white South after the Civil War was that there were just not enough eligible men around for any significant number of those up to 150,000 widows to avail themselves of that traditional solution to widowhood. So many men had died in the war, and based on the marriage rates that I mentioned earlier, of those who returned, many were already married. So that takes them off the table as well. So that means that you have boys who are coming of age, or older men, again, many of whom are already married, left. So there's no one left for these women to remarry. Now, numerous scholars of Southern women's history have explored the demographic impact of the Civil War on the ratio of women to men in the post-war South, and all have agreed, to differing degrees, albeit, that the war created a skewed gender ratio in the South after the war, and created a generation for which marriage and motherhood was not a given. Right? Before the war, marriage and motherhood was the expected outcome for Southern women. They expected to get married at a certain age. They expected to have children at a certain age. The war created, though, what was considered a marital squeeze in the South. And that it was numerically significant enough that for white Southern women in the post-war period, they were more likely to marry men that would be considered inappropriate. Inappropriate in age, inappropriate in status. So you have a tight marriage market, and you have all of these widows who have baggage, right? Either in the form of the fact that simply they were already married at some point, or they had young children to support, and that makes them less desirable as mates. So in that tight marriage market, they're just not, it's not possible for them to find a new mate. If they happen to have baggage that is wealth, right, that would make them an attractive potential mate for remarriage. The problem is that wealth actually makes them less likely to want to get remarried, because wealth is a factor for them to want to avoid remarriage, because if they remarry, they lose control of that wealth. It's not just their striking numbers, however, that identify Confederate widows as a valid focus of historical analysis. Rather, it's their role in white Southern society's efforts to rebuild the post-war South in the image of the Old South, particularly its social roles, with the Confederate South as a defining moment. In a region that's desperately trying to write its future, Confederate widows became a symbol of that new story as icons of heroism and sacrifice within the myth of the lost cause, rather than a challenge to traditional social roles. Now, as I mentioned previously, the book is broken down into two sections. The first section explores Confederate widows' experiences of their widowhood and includes a focus on how widows grieved and dealt with the emotional pain caused by their loss, and an exploration of what the loss of a husband meant in terms of a widow's practical survival. The grief that attended the loss of a significant other could be devastating. In her diary, Judith Brokenbrawl McGuire recalled one Virginia widow's reaction to the news of her husband's death in a Petersburg hospital. This is what she said. This terrible announcement was as a thunderbolt at the very feet of the poor lady, who fell to the floor as one dead. Starting up, oh, how she made that immense building ring with her bitter lamentations. Worn down with apprehension and wild with grief, she could hear no voice of sympathy. Now, although grief was not a unique experience to Confederate widows, their grief was compounded by the sudden nature of its onslaught and the context in which it occurred. In a war that economically devastated the South, preventing Confederate widows from availing themselves of much of the mourning rituals that had become the norm in the 19th century United States. Furthermore, that this catastrophic war was ultimately lost also impacted Confederate widows' experience of grief and differentiated it from their Union counterparts, as their sacrifice of their spouses perhaps seemed a little less worth it, considering the cause their men had fought for was ultimately lost. Now, during the 19th century, Americans' understanding of the ars moriendi, or the art of dying, which is how to approach death, both as the one who was dying or the one who would grieve the dead, was very complex. To say that Americans had raised the idea of death and the idea of grieving to an art form is kind of an understatement during the 19th century. There were several elements that most middle-class white Americans considered necessary for one to experience a good death within the ars moriendi, and war made all of those things a challenge. The war forced those whom dying soldiers left behind, including most notably their widows, to adjust accordingly. Whereas earlier Americans saw mourning as something that was private and should be limited because the dead had passed on to a happy eternal life, 19th century Americans glorified the role of the mourner and turned mourning into a public event with specific behavioral guidelines for those in mourning. By the time of the Civil War, it was socially expected that mourning at the death of a family member, especially a parent, a child, or a spouse, should take place in the public sphere. There was social pressure to make your private sorrow public. If one did not mourn well, that is, if you did not grieve publicly in every acceptable mode, then that demonstrated a lack of respect for the person who had died, as well as a lack of your acceptance of God's will at that person's death. Within the ars moriendi of the 19th century, dying well or achieving the good death was preeminent. Achieving a good death hinged on one's ability to give up one's soul with joy and ease, to reject attachments to the world and worldly things, and to refuse to give in to feelings of despair and self-pity. According to the ars moriendi, how one died thus epitomized the life already led and predicted the quality of life everlasting. An individual who was at peace with God, whose sins had been confessed and forgiven, would be expected to accept death easily as the method by which he or she would be transported to a better place. By contrast, a dying individual who struggled against death was not ready and had not made peace with God. Now, how one accepted death at the moment that it came could only be ascertained if other people witnessed and scrutinized and interpreted and narrated you at the hour of your death. Thus, it was vitally important that you die close to home, where your friends and your loved ones could witness you dying and capture your last words, and that would then create a tie between the living and the dead. Dying at home was also important within the ars moriendi because of the popular 19th century practice of collecting what was known as memento mori, or death relics of a loved one. Like an individual's last words, many 19th century Americans saw memento mori as a way of bridging the gap between the dead and those who survived them. They made tangible a loss known only through the abstractions of language. Now, the Civil War, because of its tremendous carnage, as well as the particular species of death that it produced, challenged but also magnified established societal expectations regarding death and mourning. As a mass bloodletting in which soldiers frequently died suddenly among a hail of bullets, expired on the battlefield from their unattended wounds, or succumbed to injuries or disease in a hospital far from home and loved ones, the war challenged 19th century Americans' understanding of the ars moriendi in several ways. Moreover, in the South especially, it challenged how well those left behind could adhere to the rules of mourning. According to the ars moriendi of the 19th century, women, and especially widows, bore the brunt of the most extensive mourning prescriptions. In cultures where a woman's identity was defined largely in terms of her relationship to her husband, his death signaled a loss of a significant part of her identity. This loss was symbolized by stringent rules for mourning that urged widows to be grave, discreet, and above cause for censure. Because the expression of emotions was perceived as feminine behavior, women were expected to be more demonstrative of their grief and pain at the loss of a loved one than were men. The prescribed mourning process in 19th century America required that women confine their activities to home and the church for the first month after the loss of a loved one, such as a parent or a child. During the rest of the first year, women could leave their homes. However, participation in celebrations or activities of a strictly social nature was frowned upon by the rest of society. For women who lost a spouse or a fiance, the requirements were much more stringent. During the first 6 months after the loss of a spouse, the period of so-called deep bereavement, a widow was expected to withdraw completely from any social and recreational activity. Among older widows, it was generally accepted that such withdrawal would become permanent. Widows were expected to mourn for at least 2.5 years, though women who lost a fiance might mourn for a year. If a widow or a bride-to-be failed to adhere to these rules, she was met with social censure. The loss of a spouse required that a woman dress in various degrees of mourning attire. For the first year of a widow's mourning, she was expected to dress entirely in black. At the end of the first year, a widow could gradually begin to wear other colors. During full mourning, white collars and trim were acceptable, while in half mourning, a widow could integrate grays and lavender into her black attire. In stark contrast to these prescriptions for widows, widowers were only expected to mourn for 3 months, and the only expectation in terms of attire was that they wear a black crape band around their arm or their hat. Now, the war disrupted Confederate widows' ability to avail themselves of the public rules of mourning in several significant ways. Not only could they not get the black attire necessary to reflect their deep mourning, and this really cannot be overstated, right? By the end of the war, it was impossible to get black material in the South. For example, in Richmond, by the end of the war, you could not get the material to make the veils, the black veil material that women wore as part of their mourning attire. You couldn't get the black veil material at all. You could get a heavy black crepe material that you could use as a substitute for $40 a yard. Now, $40 a yard is expensive now. $40 a yard then is outrageous. So imagine trying to put together a black wardrobe befitting of your deep mourning for your husband during this period. It was just impossible for some widows. Additionally, widows could not refrain from all public activities because they had been responsible for the maintenance of their households, their husbands' farms, businesses, etc., not just at that time once their husbands had died, but they had been since their husbands had left for war. So, if they're running their husband's business and now their husband has died, they can't suddenly withdraw from running that husband's business. Right? The business is still being operated. They have to continue to operate that business. The economic instability of the South made checking out for the required 6 months an impossibility. They simply couldn't do it. Moreover, what act of mourning is complete without a proper funeral? You can't very well have a proper funeral if you don't have a body. And these men are dying on battlefields, far, far away from home. The vast majority of soldiers who died in the war did not die anywhere near home, making the recovery of the body a very difficult task. Only the wealthiest of Southern women could even attempt to recover their deceased husbands' bodies during the war. Even if one had the means, they often still found it a very difficult task. In some cases, it could take years and thousands of dollars to even attempt to recover a body. And even after all of that, it still might not happen in the end. So, it's perhaps not surprising that in the post-war period during, the first couple of years of Reconstruction, as ladies' memorial associations were beginning to form in the South, one of the first things that these women began doing was kind of pooling resources to try and recover bodies from battlefields in the North to bring home, and not just the North, but in Virginia and on Southern battlefields to bring home, not necessarily to specific families, but to bring home to the Southern states, right? So to bring, for example, North Carolina soldiers home to North Carolina. It would be very easy to dismiss the war's disruption of normal grieving processes as unimportant. But for 19th century Americans, adhering to these processes made their loss meaningful. Dressing in mourning attire was seemingly just a public way to display one's mourning, but according to many scholars and psychologists, the formal observances of mourning created a sense of process, which encouraged the grieving individual to believe that they could move through the grief and come out on the other side. Moreover, since so many women in the South were in mourning during the war, dressing the part of the bereaved promised the consolation of visibly shared misery. Throughout widows' war and post-war writing, women frequently prefer to feeling untethered to their deceased loved ones because they felt like they had not been able to properly mourn for them. So to say that the war complicated their grieving process is an understatement. It would be very easy to kind of romanticize the grieving of Confederate widows. In fact, that's what a lot of the lost cause rhetoric that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit does. So I'd be remiss here if I failed to note that not every Confederate widow honestly and sincerely grieved her husband. Just as there are unhappy marriages today, there were unhappy marriages then. In fact, there's probably more unhappy marriages then because divorce was not easily acquired during that era. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about one such woman who did not honestly and sincerely grieve her husband. Laura Comer was a widow in Georgia. She was married to a planter who was very wealthy. Before he left for war, her diary was filled with constant complaints about her marriage. She described it as a prison. She frequently said that he was her jailer, that he subjected her to barbarities and embarrassments, and that he was horrific, and she just hated him and couldn't stand him. He went off to war in 1861. She continued to gripe and complain about him throughout her diary. She did express some relief when he went to war. In 1863, she stopped writing in her diary. In 1864, he died. She took up her diary again in 1866, and it's as if it's an entirely different person writing. She opens the first entry in that journal in 1866 with no mention whatsoever of her husband's death. She writes, "Bless the Lord this morning, O my soul, for his manifest goodness and mercy toward me all my days." At the time that she's writing that, she is literally still wearing deep mourning attire. She's arranging for her husband's tombstone to be put up in the cemetery. She, complains about both as chores that she finds annoying and unbearable, but as something that she has to do because it's socially expected of her. So, I just wanted to put that little aside in there because, as I said, as we move on towards the end of this talk, I don't want us to romanticize these widows too much here, because that's what the lost cause wanted us to do. So grief is certainly the first hurdle over which some widows have to jump, but it's not the only one, right? For most Confederate widows, whether or not they're grieving, their grief is accompanied by intense economic distress. Now, in normal times, as in a time that is not a time of war, the loss of a spouse could engender financial difficulties, especially for those wives who are not of the planter class. Because Confederate widows' loss occurred in the midst of a war that was wreaking havoc on the Southern landscape, that saw property values plummet and prices skyrocket with inflation rates that were rising to 5,000% by the end of the war. Even financial stability before the war could not guarantee stability in widowhood. Add to that the reality that Southern inheritance laws and practices typically were not meant to benefit widows. For example, if a husband wrote a will and left everything to his wife, typically would only do so in terms of a life estate, mind you, but before she could inherit anything, the property would have to be inventoried and valued, and then any debts would have to be paid before she could inherit anything. So, if he had $12,000 worth of property, and then $12,000 worth of debt before she inherited anything, those debts would be paid, and so she would inherit nothing. In those cases, then it would be more advantageous for her to renounce the will and basically, pretend as if he had never written a will and ask for her dower third instead. In all of the Southern states, except for Texas and Louisiana, in fact, dower provided for a third life interest in any real or personal property that the husband had, should a husband die without leaving a will. Louisiana was a community property, states, which allowed for a wife to inherit half of the marital property should a husband die without a will. But even in Louisiana, with inheriting half of that property, I mean, you're still talking about property values that were basically, in the basement, and those property values, property still had to be valued and then debts paid before, a will would be probated and inheritance doled out. So it would often be more advantageous for a widow to renounce a will and instead take a dower instead. So you can see, though, why in some cases these inheritance laws did not work to the advantage of widows. Additionally, many of the women widowed by the war were young and had young children to support. And this is in contrast to how we typically think about widows, right? We imagine them to have lived a long life with their spouses, their children to have grown, so that, if a spouse died, then the widow could go and live with an adult child and let that child take care of them. Because the Confederate military was filled with young men in the prime of their lives, not old men on their deathbeds, the result is that you have young widows with young children to support, which then complicates the way those young women have to try and figure out a way to support those children in the post-war period. Finally, the opportunities for gainful employment for white women in the agricultural South were few and far between, and the jobs that were acceptable and available typically did not pay very well. Combine all of that, and what you have is a recipe for struggle for most widowed women. Now, certainly some widowed women were able to thrive as manless women. Julietta Chile was one such woman. She successfully took over her husband's farm and actually enlarged it after the war. She was so successful, that when the census taker came around in the decades after the war, even though she had several adult sons living with her in her household, he, decade after decade, recognized her as the household head in the census. And this is not the norm. I mean, there were other widows in Brunswick County who also had adult sons living with them, and the adult sons were recognized as the household head in those households, which is telling. Other widows in more urban areas took over their husbands' businesses. Jane King in Richmond, Virginia, took over her husband's ice business after he died. She, in fact, expanded that ice business in the post-war period to include a coal delivery business. She was so successful in running that business that she became known in Richmond as the Ice Queen. It's interesting, that little moniker. It's not entirely clear whether that was a reference to her business or her business style, but nonetheless, she was the Ice Queen of Richmond. There was an article written about her in the Richmond paper where she was referred to as the Ice Queen. Other women ventured to establish their own commercial enterprises. Lizzie Osborne in Atlanta took over her husband's general merchandise store and added on a boarding house and did quite well for herself in Atlanta. There's no exact recipe for success for Confederate widows. Sometimes it was a loophole in a will, which was what was the case for Julietta Chile. Her husband had left everything to her in his will. Probably inadvertently, he left it as a fee simple title instead of a life estate, as most husbands typically did. There were a couple of indications in the will that he intended it to be a life estate, but he never came out and said life estate. The difference, of course, being that if it was a life estate, she could not sell it, she could not improve it, she could only live off of that land. She couldn't bequeath it, she could just live off of it. Fee simple meant she owned it outright. She could do whatever she wanted with it. But he failed to explicitly designate it that way, and that was to her advantage. Sometimes it was that the widow had a good business acumen, like Jane King and Lizzie Osborne. Sometimes it was just luck. There was no, tried and true recipe for success. Regardless of why some widows thrived as manless women, the reality was that the vast majority of them did not thrive. Many women struggled, and many of them became dependent on friends or family members for support. And when states began offering financial support, they became dependent upon the state. Which brings me to the second section of the book. While the first section focuses on how women dealt with their own widowhood. In the second section, I explore how the white South as a society dealt with all of these manless women who had no real place within the traditional Southern gender roles that Southern society was trying so desperately to reassert in the post-war South. Now, the antebellum South had been built on the twin pillars of racial slavery and patriarchy. Both were necessary for the system of rules and roles that had governed pre-war Southern society. For white Southern men to regain both real and ideological supremacy after the war, they had to establish that they were still legally superior to Black men and that white women were still socially, economically, and politically dependent, ensconced within the domestic sphere with men as their providers and protectors. Just as the cognitive dissonance unleashed by slavery's end ignited demands among whites for ideological continuity in terms of race, hence the Black Codes of Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction, the racial violence and intimidation of vigilante groups like the KKK, and eventually the Jim Crow segregation that emerged after the end of Congressional Reconstruction and the redemption of Southern governments by elite white Southern men. Likewise, the war produced tension with regard to gender roles and patriarchy. That tension emerged from the reality that white Southern men had been beaten by men that they considered to be their inferiors, the so-called pasty-faced clerks, right? The Yankees, right? The factory workers, as well as the wartime evidence that white Southern women had indeed capably run farms while men were gone, right? That was temporary, except in the case of all of these Confederate widows who were manless permanently in the post-war period. These women were manless, they could not remarry. All of that combined to raise questions about traditional white gender roles by casting a shadow of doubt on Southern men's claim to their patriarchal role as women's providers and protectors. If white Southern men were to reclaim their role as patriarchy, they needed white women to be back in their place, safely ensconced within proper households, provided for and protected by men. The deaths of so many white Southern men during the war made that literally impossible for many of the women rendered manless by the war. Thus, by definition, Confederate widows were outside of their traditional role as dependents, and white Southern society had to figure out how to reconcile that within their reassertion of traditional gender roles. One way that they did this was ideologically through rhetoric that celebrated such women's perpetual grief for their dead husbands and willing sacrifice of their loved ones for the cause. What could represent a Confederate widow's continued dependence on her deceased spouse better than if she mourned him forever? And this actually worked out pretty well since so many of them could not remarry. I mean, if they can't remarry, then obviously they're mourning for him forever. When poets and novelists, religious leaders, lost cause celebrants, and politicians wrote and spoke about Confederate widows, it was always their unending grief that they emphasized, reifying Confederate widows' roles as perpetual mourners and elevating them to the top of the gender ideal for their continued loyalty to their men. If the plantation mistress was the ideal antebellum white Southern woman, the Confederate widow who ceaselessly mourned her lost spouse and his cause was an icon among postbellum white Southern women. Confederate widows as subjects in poems and as characters, main or tangential in other literary forms, became one of the lost cause literature's most obvious elements. They're the perfect protagonists because they had tangible ties to the cause, had made the ultimate sacrifice short of their own deaths for the values of the cause, and unlike dead soldiers, were still very present in the post-war South. Whether they served as perpetual mourners and inspiration for memorial activity in Confederate poetry, or sympathetic symbols in Confederate fiction, Confederate widows' ever-presence in the lost cause literature of the late 19th and early 20th century ensured a place for real Confederate widows in the lexicon of true Southern women. In poems and stories that use the Civil War and its aftermath as a setting, actual widows, virtual widows, which are women who had been engaged or at least in love, but had not yet married, that lost that love and the potential for marriage in the war, and potential widows became mainstays. Perhaps this is not surprising given their noticeable presence in the wartime and post-war South, but the use of these figures in Confederate literature serves several important purposes as well. They reinforce an Old South worldview of patriarchy, even while acknowledging the presence of change. They also reinforced Southerners' desire to imagine that widows, though they were bereaved, were not discontent with the lot that the war had dealt them. Finally, they contributed to white Southerners' collective view of Confederate widows as the truest of Southern women, not despite their widowhood, but because of it. A major component in the treatment of Confederate widows in lost cause literature was to emphasize the willingness of these women without complaint to sacrifice their lovers on the altar of the cause. Although widows appeared in examples of Confederate poetry and fiction, the differences between the genres allowed authors to address Confederate widowhood in different ways. Confederate poetry, for example, presented a very emotional but very simplistic portrait of Confederate widowhood, whether it focused on individual loss or used widowhood to symbolize the South's collective loss. Focusing primarily on a romanticized version of the grief of widows, such works rarely address the very real emotional struggles, much less the everyday practical troubles that Confederate widows faced in their daily efforts to survive. In Confederate poetry, widows were typically young, beautiful, most importantly, gracious in their loss. Their economic, legal, and social struggles were rarely part of poets' portrayals. Instead, poets often used the imagery of white Southern women's sacrifice of their husbands and sweethearts to the war effort to engender a public passion for the cause or to soothe the South's collective mind after the end of the war, reminding them that their cause had been a just one and should be remembered as such despite the war's loss. Such commemoration allowed Southerners as a whole to empathize with Confederate widows. It also buttressed the reestablishment of the traditional gender ideal of vulnerable Southern women in need of provision and protection. Through Confederate poetry, Southerners could imagine beautiful young widows quietly longing for a generation of dashing young husbands lost to the war's violence. Like Southern poets, Southern novelists also used Confederate widows as characters in their wartime and post-war work. Despite the obvious differences between the two genres, many of the same themes that appeared in Confederate poetry also appeared in Confederate fiction, particularly women's willing sacrifice of their husbands to the war effort. Unlike Confederate poetry, however, Confederate fiction often treated the experience of widowhood a little more substantively. In addition to dealing with grief and those kinds of issues, many works of fiction could also address more practical issues like how widows had to survive practically and the struggle that they faced. Confederate fiction was a little deeper, let's just say. There were differences, however, in how Southern authors dealt with Confederate widowhood if they were male authors or female authors. While Southern authors before the Civil War, if they used them at all, most often portrayed Confederate widows as mere objects the heroes and heroines pitied or scorned. By contrast, Southern fiction writers after the war readily incorporated them as examples of true Southern womanhood. In the case of many female authors, they incorporated them as the actual heroines of their stories, while male authors more often used them as window dressing or objects for the male heroes to act upon. After the war, Confederate widows were an unavoidable reality, and authors of Southern fiction incorporated them into their tales accordingly, thereby contributing to the evolution of a place for these particular mammoth women within traditional gender roles in the post-war South as the truest of Southern women because of their widowhood for the cause. Poets and novelists are not the only Southerners waxing poetic on the subject of Confederate widows in post-war society, however. Confederate memorial groups also trained their attention on celebrating the willing sacrifices of women widowed by the war. Like wartime and post-war Southern poetry and fiction, the commemorative and benevolent activities of post-war Confederate organizations contributed to the creation of not only an acceptable but a celebrated place for Confederate widows within the reassertion of traditional gender roles in the post-bellum South. This is true of the ladies' memorial associations that occupied themselves primarily with memorializing dead Confederate soldiers during Reconstruction when Confederate men were disfranchised. It was also true of heritage groups that emerged later in the 19th century, like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate veterans, with noted differences between how female and male groups addressed Confederate widowhood. These heritage groups thrived after so-called redemption, when traditional memorialization, which had focused on grief and mourning, gave way and evolved into more of a celebration of Confederate culture, including most notably its race, class, and gender mores. During Reconstruction, memorial activities that celebrated Confederate soldiers who gave their lives during the war reassured still living Southern men of their masculinity by celebrating the masculinity involved in fighting for the cause despite the loss of the war. Within its celebration of Southern women's steadfastness on the home front, memorial activities also elevated the status of Confederate heroines, the widows of those soldiers who died. During Reconstruction, when most white Southerners, even those considered among the pre-war elite, suffered a financial decline, it was impossible to provide sufficient economic aid to all of the Confederate widows in need through private charitable sources. Moreover, with Reconstruction governments not in white Southerners' hands, financial assistance for Confederate survivors would not be forthcoming from the state either. Participating in the Confederate Memorial Days organized by white Southern women and contributing even just a little bit to the raising of a monument to honor the memory of soldiers who died during the war and the families they left behind, however, were well within the financial reach of many white Southerners. Such post-war commemoration of Confederate soldiers and their families implicitly drew attention to the sacrifices of Confederate widows. By participating in or contributing financially to memorial activities, still living white Southern men could position themselves as substitute patriarchs for their dead comrades' widows, not because they provided for such women, but because they facilitated a public recognition of their sacrifice and their grief, paving the way for later efforts to provide financial assistance in the form of Confederate pensions once white Southerners regained control of Southern state government. In other words, even if Southerners and the Southern states in the immediate aftermath of the war were unable to give monetary assistance to Confederate widows en masse, they could support memorial activities that not only recognized but indeed celebrated such women's domestic sacrifices. As an editorialist in Augusta, Georgia postured, the knowledge of sympathy is to an afflicted soul what curatives are to the sick, and it was never more so than with this great class. To know that their husbands or sons live in the heart of the people is to the wives and mothers almost a sufficiency in life. So in the minds of this editorialist and in the minds of many white Southerners, memorialization activities were just as important, perhaps even more important, than actual provision among Confederate survivors. So the solution to the widow problem was not solved just through rhetoric, however. White Southern society also had to deal with the practical reality that Confederate widows existed and that they were more often than not struggling to survive as manless women. The contradiction between all these pretty words that were so often spoken about Confederate widows by poets, by novelists, by lost cause celebrants, by politicians, and then the extreme poverty that many Confederate widows often existed in was too much for white Southerners to abide. If Confederate widows were the best of white Southern womanhood, how could they be allowed to exist mired in poverty? Accordingly, the White South needed to do more than just laud such women for their sacrifice. They needed to provide a means for them to be provided for again. They needed to put their money where their mouth was in terms of this substitute patriarchy. And that is exactly what they did when they created Confederate pensions. In the late 19th century, state after former Confederate state created Confederate pensions for first Confederate veterans and very quickly thereafter for Confederate widows. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I will say that the language that they used when they created these pensions is telling. When they created pensions for veterans, they always couched it in terms that they were paying them for services rendered, right? They're paying veterans for services rendered to the Confederacy. When they created the pensions for widows, they said that they were paying them not for services rendered, but as recognition for their willing sacrifice for the cause. right? So not for services rendered, but for their willing sacrifice for the cause. So it's right in line with all of the pretty words of that rhetoric that they have been talking about for all these years leading up to this, and creating this place for this manless women. Um, so taken together, this rhetorical celebration of Confederate widows in Confederate poetry and Confederate literature, the memorial activity of Confederate associations, all of that taken together with the distribution of Confederate aid by Southern state governments, all combined to create this collective imagination that Confederate widows were willing martyrs for the cause, who not only belonged within the fold of proper Southern womanhood, but were icons of it because of their sacrifice for the cause. So instead of presenting a challenge to the reassertion of traditional gender roles, which they very well could have done because they were outside of it, and could not be a part of it. They're not part of those traditional gender roles because they're not part of a marriage anymore. Instead of presenting that challenge, they were kind of re-ensconced within it by defining their manlessness as a willing sacrifice, and elevating them to this role as icons for their sacrifice for the cause. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have now.
Yeah, if you have some questions, please put them in the chat. I have some questions as well. Let's start. Um, in your research on Southern women in mourning after the Civil War, did you come across any references to Queen Victoria or her influence, or is that a connection made of historical urban legend that gets repeated but isn't really grounded in the sources?
Well, certainly during the 19th century and the development of the Ars Moriendi, that's all very much, a part of Queen Victoria and all that. She had quite an influence on all that, yes.
You mentioned that the women could not marry again, but were there any other women that did marry? I mean,
Yeah, there certainly
I
were
can't,
some that
yeah,
remarried. Yeah, there
yeah.
were some. It's just a very small percentage that were able to. And I mean, it's interesting who there's, in coming doing this research. So this research it's a very long it was a long process for me. I mean, this started out as a seminar paper in my master's program that developed into my master's thesis and then my dissertation. And then I kind of put it aside for, 20 years, and then I turned it into a book. But when I did the master's thesis, I did a statistical analysis of a community in Brunswick County, Virginia. And so I kind of followed this group of 70 widows from the war through 1920. And of those widows, it was like, I think 13% were able to remarry. So it's a pretty small number that were able to remarry. And those that remarried, they like the reasons that they remarried was interesting. And of course I didn't have any, it was all based on census and property records and wills. I didn't have diaries from any of these women. But in some cases, it was a woman who had not inherited any property. She married a guy who had a lot of property, right? So I inferred from that, that she saw an opportunity to, find financial stability, right? And you can look at like the work of Suzanne Lebstock in Petersburg, Virginia. Any remarriage, it's a tangled, kind of complex series of questions that women ask themselves, right? We like to think about it as this romantic, oh, well, maybe she found love again, whatever. But in most cases, it's a series of questions. Does she have children that she needs to support, or is she trying to have children, right? Is she trying to become a mother? If she has children, they're most likely, she needs to support them. So she's probably seeking a new husband, but they are most likely an impediment to her finding a new husband. Right? If she has wealth, that makes her an attractive candidate for remarriage, but it makes her less likely to want to remarry.
Yeah,
Because if she remarries, she loses access to that wealth, either because it becomes his or because it goes back to her previous husband's estate.
gotcha.
So,
She,
it's a complex question, basically.
yeah, absolutely.
For each
Shelia
person.
says, for contrast, have you looked at how union widows grieved?
I have not. And that's one of the things in the book. The conclusion is basically a series of questions that I think other people or myself should ask and write about. That's one of them, is a comparison with union widows. Yeah. I think that would be really interesting, because of the lost cause, um, Confederate widows. That's one of the questions that I have is did Union widows kind of find this community where they become elevated in this way that Confederate widows do, or do they just kind of, you know, go back to life as normal? I don't know.
Mhm.
But I find it interesting. I just know I have not done that research. I hope someone does. And I guess if they don't, then I might turn my attention there. I'm not sure.
And one last question. When you were talking at the very end about the pensions that were created, um, who was paying for those pensions?
The
I
Southern
mean, you're calling the Confederate pensions. Well, there was no Confederate government at that point, right?
The states, each state had their own system. They called them Confederate pensions, but so Georgia had their own set of pensions, Louisiana, Alabama. So each state administered their own pensions. And, I mean, one of the things, there's a whole chapter on pensions in the book, but they're really fascinating because each state administered them differently. There were some similarities across the states, like for example, they each only gave pensions to widows who remained unmarried. If you got remarried, you lost your pension. Um, but they each gave different amounts. So,
Yeah.
you might get more in fact, you did get more in Georgia than you got in Virginia. Um, they had different requirements for when you had to have married your husband. Um, and that changed over time. Um, but so
And
the
did it come from
amount of
state
money,
funds? Was it state funds
yeah, they paid for them out of state funds. So
at
like they could
Texas?
have been building roads, they could have been paying for education, they could have been doing all sorts of things, and instead they're collecting taxes to pay these pensions to
Now,
veterans and widows. Yeah,
just
I mean
just
it
to
was an ungodly amount of money.
just to kind of also piggyback on that. I mean, we were also talking about Reconstruction governments, weren't we, for a period of time, or is this
Yeah, these were
happening
after
after
that.
these are after the
This
Reconstruction
is after
governments?
that. Yeah,
Okay,
the first one was in the 18 Virginia. The first one was 1888. This is all post Reconstruction. They
gotcha.
did
Okay,
have actually before, like during Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction. So when you basically had the same people who steered Southern states out of the Union. You did have in 4 state programs of assistance to veterans and widows. In that brief window where you have black codes and all that going on. And then congressional reconstruction takes over and all that ends. So it's a very
gotcha.
brief period of continuity where you have white Southerners who are in charge. But as soon as Congress takes over Reconstruction, all of it ends. And then it comes back when you have so-called redemption and white Southerners take over again.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Gross, thank you so much. We really appreciate you speaking to us tonight. You have congratulations on the book, Sisterhood of the
Thank you.
Lost Cause, Confederate Widows in the New South. And I want to thank everybody for participating in the Friends of the Cabildo Second Thursday lecture series. And I believe Chris will be back next month. So yeah, I hope to see you on one of our lectures. But thank you so much, Jennifer. It was an excellent talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.